first of all, acknowledge that we are meeting on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to the momentous people, the traditional owners of the land. And also just acknowledge what a good week it has been in terms of Aboriginal politics to see Uluru finally have the integrity that it deserves restored. And hopefully this restoration project of Lake Pedder also contributes to that integrity of Tasmanian history and Aboriginal community and restoration of their place in the landscape and in the cultural history of Tasmania. So because we've got a small group, I thought it would be a good idea if we just did a brief chat and then just went to questions, because that's probably of greater interest and it's very special because we have the great nephew of Brenda Heen here with us. So isn't that great?
Who's the great nephew?
So before we start then, I think perhaps we should just go around the circle and say who we are. So I'm Christine Milne, I'm the co-convener of the Restore Lake Pedder group.
I'm Anita Wild. I've been commissioned by the Lake Pedder Restoration Group to build the case and update the ecology and the science on the restoration of Lake Pedder.
Chris Harries, I'm a member of Climate Tasmania Advisory Board, and so I deal with energy issues a lot, and sort of in an ad hoc capacity as part of this group until they find somebody who's much more up on the modern energy, national energy market and so forth.
And my name's Jessica Robbins. I'm the project officer for the Lake Pedder Restoration Committee.
Dan Brune. I'm I guess a bushwalker and photographer, and spent a lot of time in the area and very interested in the project, and very keen to hear what Anita and Chris and Christine have to say.
I'm Patsy Jones. It's good to see some younger people here today as well. So thanks for coming along.
No worries. I'm Will Ditcham, and just pretty keen to learn some new stuff.
I'm Oliver Gallagher. I'm starting to get into like bushwalking, guiding kind of thing, so this kind of thing is pretty interesting to me at the moment. So I thought I'd learn a bit from here.
I'm Caleb Bond. I'm just here to find out some more about the lake and everything.
I'm Mike Kerr, I'm media. I'm a good friend. I was in the campaign in '72 as a 19-year-old and took Brenda into the lake when she was doing a vigil on the dunes in a little tin dish. We had to sleep overnight on the banks of the Sassafras River, pictured over there, winding our way into the lake because we didn't get in the first day. It took us longer to get there. We slept, four adults in a tin dish, in a boat, on the lake, up a tree. We wedged ourselves into a tree and erected a tent. So we're 4 adults in a tin dish on a lake, up a tree in a tent with Brenda. I won't talk about the ablutions to save you from images of your grandmother? Great aunt, that's right. Anyway, and still on the committee. It changed my life, that first visit I made.
We just introducing ourselves.
I'm Liam. I've never been to Lake Pedder. I'm just interested in hearing about it.
Okay, and Hilary?
Hilary Bennell. I was a campaigner and first visited the lake in 1968, 67. Spent a lot of time campaigning.
Okay, so just as a quick introduction, Lake Pedder, the whole campaign for Pedder came to a head in the early 1970s, and the community really rallied to try to stop the inundation of Lake Pedder by Hydro Tasmania. It was the extreme end of hydro industrialisation in Tasmania. The hydro had got to the point where they were wanting to dam everything. It just became a reason for being almost. And so Lake Pedder was where the community stood up to the hydro, and out of the Lake Pedder was inundated. The last weekend that people could actually go into Lake Pedder was the March long weekend in 1972. So we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the inundation of Pedder in March 2022. So there has been an ongoing campaign for 50 years to try to restore Pedder, but coming up to the 50th anniversary gives us a brilliant opportunity to coincide with a big anniversary. But better than that, it also coincides with the beginning of the United Nations decade of ecosystem restoration. So the United Nations has realised that to address climate, you have to address the extinction crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the collapse of ecosystems, and sadly, a lot of the work that's been done on climate has focused only on renewable energy and the transition from fossil fuels, and hasn't taken into account the important contribution that nature and landscapes make to maintaining resilience in ecosystems and storing carbon in ecosystems. So this is an attempt to put nature back into the climate and biodiversity crisis solutions book, if you like. So I got in touch with the United Nations decade and said that the restoration of Lake Pedder should be a global flagship project for the United Nations, and they're quite enthusiastic about that idea. Of course, they're nervous about the fact that the state party, Australia, is not on board with that agenda. So I've said, well, we're working on that aspect of it, but nevertheless, that shouldn't stop them from endorsing the project. So that's the big picture context in which this fits. So as a bit of a history of where we've been on the restoration, most of the campaigning over the last 50 years has been to try and change the politics around Lake Pedder and the hydro to get them to agree to restore the lake. That came to built momentum, if you like, in the mid-1990s, and there was a House of Representatives inquiry into the restoration of Lake Pedder. And that was completely derailed by the first time in Australia where an environment argument was used against the environment. So Professor Nigel Forteith, who was a professor in aquaculture at Tasmanian University, came out and said that if Lake Pedder was restored, 4,000 platypus would die. And so all these people were saying you can't possibly restore the lake because all the platypus will die, and so on and so forth. It was complete nonsense, but what it exposed for us is we hadn't done enough of the science to be able to demonstrate why it was complete nonsense. So for me, I was at university when the lake was flooded. I was horrified by what had happened. I seriously thought that evidence-based politics existed. I was only 17 or 18. Yes, it was a foolish notion, but I did think that at university. And that was my lesson in that actually evidence-based doesn't necessarily make the decisions in politics. And so I determined then that I'd never let it happen again, which is why I got involved in the Franklin campaign later, and which now, almost 50 years later, I've decided this is a really good time to close the gap, close the circle, get Lake Pedder restored in the context of ecosystem restoration and in the context of carbon and climate and so on. So that's where we are at. I have to reassure you, I said this privately but publicly, that everybody who's ever worked on the Pedder campaign has always pursued what happened to Max Price and to Brenda Heen. No one has forgotten them, and everybody to this day would still like to know what actually happened to them. That is one of the mysteries of the original Pedder campaign that survives to this day. So this time around we decided how we would do it was to break up the restoration proposal into all its component parts, because ecological restoration is a science. It is not just a political issue or a socio-economic issue. There is a whole science that goes with it, and if we're going to do this properly and be regarded as part of a UN flagship, we have to do this properly, and we have to document it to demonstrate that this is how you can do it for other communities and NGOs around the world, small NGOs like us, to how you would actually do this. So we've broken it up into several components. First thing we did was raise the money to be able to employ Anita as a restoration ecologist to start looking at the science of restoring Pedder. What will it take? Will the vegetation come back? What are the erosion issues? What are the hydrology issues and stuff? So Anita will talk about that in a minute. But we also have to look at the energy issues, because the Minister and Hydro Tasmania will always say that if you take Lake Pedder out of the hydro system as a storage lake, the lights will go out in Tasmania, energy security will be threatened, the world as we know it will come to an end. So we have to be able to demonstrate that removing Lake Pedder as a storage lake on the current hydro system is not going to make very much difference at all. It's easy to demonstrate that in terms of actual energy production. It would take one Cattle Hill wind farm and another 12 turbines in addition to replace all of the energy that currently the water generates through Lake Gordon on the system. But we have to go through all the economics of that. And Chris is going to talk to that in a minute. We also have to have all the legals in place, because this means Derwent Valley Council regulations right through to the state government, then the federal government under the national environment laws, through to the World Heritage Convention. So we're going from absolutely local to global in terms of the regulatory frameworks that will have to be changed. We've got a legal project underway right now to identify all those, and also the sequence in which those things will have to be changed in order for this to all occur. And then, of course, there is the political and the socio-economic. And the socio-economic in Tasmania is quite important, because ecological restoration is actually a labour-intensive thing to do. And areas where people have lost their jobs in the mining industry or in the forest industry, you often have reasonably high levels of semi-skilled or unskilled people unemployed. And so ecological restoration is a way of using those skills and getting people out in the bush, which is what they like to be doing, actually, which is why they've ended up being loggers in many cases. So there's quite a strong case in the Derwent Valley, particularly for local employment levels that would be able to be, people would be able to be recruited as part of the socio-economic work. And Todd Dudley, who's the other co-convener of this group, who lives up in St Helens, has already demonstrated that with restoration of pine plantations back to native forest. And a lot of the people he's employed are the people who were workers in the forest industry, because they've got the skills with all of the machinery and so on to get in there and do it. So that's the overall framework and the plan. And we are now raising money. We've got the science underway, we've got the law underway. We now have to have the money to get the energy analysis underway. And once we've got these things in place, we can then go out and have a much bigger public campaign, because we can answer the question. If people say, oh, but what about the platypus? Oh, but what about this or that? And also, oh, what about renewable energy? We've got the answers to those questions. So Anita, you might just want to talk about what you've been doing on the science, and then we'll get any questions you have.
Yeah, I've started looking at where we were with the science. So I was engaged by the group about 6 months ago, and the first thing was that there was a lot of information in 1995 for Pedder 2000 with the Senate committee, and so there were various themes in that people looked at, and there was some like geology, and people looked at vegetation, whether or not it's going to grow back, are there going to be erosion issues, that sort of thing. And that's fabulous, because that's given me a baseline that I can sort of work with. But as Christine was saying, ecological restoration is now a profession, and it's based on, there's botanists, there's ecologists, there's hydrologists, there's a lot of people who've got together, and around the world we've had some really, really big projects. And in Europe they're spending hundreds of millions of euros, so that's even more dollars, on ecological restoration projects, because I think humanity is sort of at that point where we've kind of realised that, you know, for some of these areas we have to do restoration because, you know, we've taken it too far, that sort of thing. So what I'm doing is bringing in a lot of the information from a lot of overseas studies. I've also worked a lot down in the southwest myself, and I've actually seen that these areas, there's a lot of resilience in the system. Resilience meaning that if we just stop the threatening processes, or if we just remove the things that are stopping nature from coming back, then nature will come back. So that's part of the studies that I'm doing. So what I've done, I've broken it down, so that's sort of the philosophy behind it, I suppose, but I've actually broken it down into its components as well. So there's the biotic components, there's the flora, there's the fauna, there's the organic soils, and they're the real key to the whole restoration project, that we've got the organic soils largely intact, still under the lake. And they may or may not have a seed bank, but it's the key to actually being able to establish vegetation on those organic soils as well. So we're quite lucky that that's actually still there. So that's the sort of biotic components. Then there's looking at geomorphology and geology, and also looking at, you know, do we drop the lake really quickly or do we do it gradually? Because what they said in 1995 was, we'll do it gradually. But it's a big lake. I've been sea kayaking on it a few times. It takes nothing for it to blow up, as you guys would have realised when you did the Pedder paddle. And yeah, you got chopped like that, and yeah, coming at you from various angles.
It's about 240 square kilometres now, so it's a big lake.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and large wind fetch distances and things like that. So we understand now with hydrology and a lot of computer modelling and that sort of thing, we can actually select areas around the lake that will be at risk of erosion at the speed that we drop the lake and that sort of thing. They may require intensive intervention, that will need some engineering solutions there or some wave breaking solutions or things like that, but it's all been done. We've got overseas to look at. We've actually got work done on organic soils and things in Australia that's been done as well. It's just the scale of the issue that's going to be sort of different. It's not the largest restoration project in the world, but it's actually it's still up there.
It's one of the biggest.
Yeah, yeah. So what I'm coming from is broken it down into those components, and I'm not doing this all because I'm not an expert on each field. All these fields are specialised as well, but there's a suite of people around Tassie in particular, a couple on the mainland as well, who are still really passionate about Lake Pedder and going, yep, that's the information we had then, let's update it now. So it's collating all that information together and going, these are going to be the challenges. You know, it's not going to be easy, but it's achievable. These are the challenges, these are how we're going to address them, and this is the priority for those things as well. And this is the likely outcome as well, which, you know, is the question that everyone's answering. So that's the way I've been looking at it, that's what I'm currently doing.
And Chris is looking at the energy stuff. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, I'll be quick. There's several things that could be said, but I'll just stick to two maybe. I go way back to Lake Pedder myself. I was working at the aluminium smelter as a trainee metallurgist at the time, and as I described at Ferntree, in one of the similar, the entire hydroelectric system in Tasmania is configured around the bulk users' use. That is to maintain supply to them at a constant level 12 months of the year, which requires them having very large storages. There are only 5 dams in Tasmania that are above 1 million megalitres, and they are there specifically to cater for the larger the metallurgical industries, which we've only got 3 left.
So they are EZ, Temco and Comalco.
Comalco, yeah.
And Temco is about to make an announcement.
Yeah. So, but first of all, just a bit of a background on carbon accounting and hydroelectric schemes. If you were to build a hydroelectric scheme today, the environmental, because climate change is such a big issue, you have to do a lot of work. Because when you do hydroelectric schemes, you flood entire large valleys full of forests and soils and so forth. And in the Lake Pedder case, a very large area with very shallow. So there are huge implications, a huge amount of evaporation in such a shallow and huge area. But you'd have to actually account for the amount of carbon that you would take out of the system if you were to build that scheme. I remember Andrew Blakers putting a number on if the Gordon Below Franklin scheme had gone ahead, the number of years you would run an equivalent size thermal power station, and it would amount to something like between 10 and 20 years to make up for the lost carbon that scheme would have drowned. So it's very significant. The amount of climate impact of hydroelectric schemes is not recognised by very many people. But if you were to build one now, you would actually have to do all that carbon accounting. The corollary of all of that is if you reverse and you unflood an area, then you can make an accounting of the carbon gain that you make. In the case of Lake Pedder, it's much less than a lot of other schemes because it's not a highly forested area, but there's a certain amount of soil carbon, etc. But still, there is an environment, there is a climate plus from recovering a hydro scheme. It's one thing that's worth just keeping in mind. The federal government supplies all the carbon accounting for the whole of the nation, and what they do is they discount to zero anything which is too hard to measure or which is historic. And both of those fall into hydroelectric. So hydroelectric schemes are measured as zero impact. But as I say, if you do anything different now, then you would have to start taking into account, because it's no longer historic if you were to do something modern. That's one thing. The second thing is yes, the other thing which Christine mentioned, the amount of energy you lose from Lake Pedder could be recovered by a single significant wind farm. Put it in terms of climate, the state government at present has, and for the last 2 years, has been boasting that Tasmania is now zero carbon because of, and they're not saying this explicitly, but the data that's coming in is that because of the decline of forestry in Tasmania, the gain in carbon within Tasmania is totally overshadowing all our other uses, and so the state government is rather perniciously using that information to argue that without doing anything at all, we're now up to the year 2050 in terms of achieving our targets. They don't mention that specifically that they are actually in favour of expanding forestry as hard as they could possibly go, and that's all of this is temporary, so it's tweaking of numbers. But if you were to look at the effect of taking Lake Pedder out of the system, it's minuscule compared to the amount of carbon that is gained by having a controlled forestry industry which maximises, even if you are exporting, but managed in such a way that maximises the carbon content of forests that we have. Now, there are lots of other things to be said, but they are two things which I think ought to be configured into this debate.
Lowering the lake gradually, or completely, and the erosion effect. Just because I'm not quite sure of the answer, if you pulled the plug and drained it all in one big go, what's the negative of doing that?
Well, the oceans rise.
Look, it probably predominantly the concerns around that are the fauna actually adapting that quickly enough and being able to move down quickly enough. There also is the feasibility of actually being able to do it, looking at the engineering of getting a siphon large enough on serpentine to actually be able to do that and to get a couple of spillways in. But, you know, I worked at Hydro for 10 years, engineers can do anything. Well, they'll tell you they can do anything. But, you know, so the driver will be the ecological thing. So predominantly it's actually adaptation of the animals. The other thing is, and there's been a preference for some people that thinking that, you know, you drain it slowly, then the plants will colonise gradually. So you get, you know, you've got this lake that's bare, you've got this edge of vegetation beside it, and most of the recruitment, the natural establishment of vegetation will come from seed drop from adjacent plants. There'll also be some seed that has been carried around by the water as well. So the thought was, you know, you have the seed drop, you get plants established, then they can, you know, seed and they become nurse plants for that sort of thing. That means a time frame of decades. So what the evidence is pointing towards so far is that because those organic soils are actually so important for re-establishment, because the whole west coast is actually really very depauperate. When you look at the geology, it's on quartzite, so it's got really low nutrients and minerals in it, so it actually can be difficult to establish plants. When Hydro did the developments, Anthony Pyman and that sort of thing, this was in the late 80s, even then they realised that if you want the vegetation to regrow, you use those organic soils are important. So when they were doing those dams, they actually scalped the organic soils out of the dams and put it and stockpiled it and then put it into their revegetation areas. And so there's quite a difference between the areas that had the organic soils compared to the ones that were bare quartzite. So going back onto that, our approach is, and it's pretty much considered, let's maintain those soils as much as possible. If you dropped it really slowly, you'd end up with a bathtub ring around, probably as the wind action and the wave action and things sort of erodes those organic soils. So that's why the evidence at the moment is probably pointing towards a quicker drop of the lake rather than that gradual one, which was probably, preferred in 1995.
The other issue is Huonville. The Huon Council has permitted the construction of dwellings on the floodplains around Huonville, and if you pull out the Scott's Peak Dam and let it all go, you could well induce a flood in the lower Huon. But again, that's something that can be managed.
Yeah.
Yes, Hilary.
That's something we had a bit of discussion about. I studied geology under Prof Carey. Prof Sam Carey was a world-renowned geologist, and when I saw him in '94, he said the Scott's Peak Dam is built on the fault line. It blew in 1890 and broke plates and dressers in Launceston, and it will go again. So that might be a time bomb that's waiting to go off one day. So when you look at that,
in which case the whole lot will come gushing down at that
there will
point
be a
anyway.
catastrophe in Huonville.
Yeah.
When you look at
Yeah,
that one, Anita?
the Edgar Fault, you can see it on Scott's Peak Road. It's actually going down the left-hand side.
They've got very big cracks in the dam.
When I was managing the Lake Pedder shop at Elizabeth Street beside the GPO and was on the dole, I got asked by the dole office to go and work for a company called Molding, which is an asphalt company, to put an asphalt layer on the Edgar Dam.
To hold it together.
On the Scott's Peak Dam because the Edgar Fault had put
So there are a lot of
crack.
problems.
Yeah.
A lot of problems with the Scott's Peak Dam, and
It may do the job for us.
it may do the
But
job for us.
it's a very relevant issue at the moment. What's happened is because of some dam breaches, and usually in poorer countries, the standards for dams now in Australia have all been upgraded. Just the waterworks where I live, they're spending a huge amount of money. Every single dam in Australia has to be examined, and I'm just wondering whether these dams are actually included in this, because where there's habitation below, and they have to completely change everything that they used to do in relation to dams and expend.
Dive works are employed by the hydro to go send underwater cameras down and send the computer images back, and there's cracks you can put your arm into.
Yes, I'm just suggesting that because all this work is being done all around Australia and enforced by standards, it may be very important to make sure that the same is applying to those particular dams.
Absolutely, because it might well be that removes one of the issues. When the hydro will have to decide how much money they're prepared to spend on fixing up the dam as opposed to letting it go. So that decision might be made on those kinds of issues anyway. But that's clearly one of the issues. Any other questions?
What's the sort of time we're looking at?
Look, there's two approaches to that. There's what's feasible technologically wise. There's a few approaches and considerations. What is possible for hydrology for the downstream rivers? That's one thing we have to consider as well. This isn't just about Lake Pedder. There's downstream rivers that will be affected by. And look, the impact of dams on downstream rivers is catastrophic because it removes all the sediment through to the rivers. It generally puts cold water into rivers, like colder than it should be, and it actually reduces the floods. Rivers need floods. They need floods to move sediment through and that sort of thing. So those considerations, the hydrology considerations we're working on at the moment, And then there's ecologically. So I was talking about, you know, the sort of succession, I suppose, you get of the recruitment of the plants coming down. Ideally, as a plant ecologist, I would say let's have a dewatering when we're coming into like early spring or something like that, when we're getting recruitment and that sort of thing on these areas, because we've got dark soils. Those soils will heat up in summer. We have to consider that. So I would say let's do it over a spring sort of summer period. But then you look at the hydrology and you go, well, in spring you probably don't want to be putting more flows down the river then. So at the moment there's a lot of discussion between these competing, I suppose, variables. And I think the way we're thinking about dealing with that is to almost have a decision tree or something like that to say, okay, these are the critical factors for the hydrology, these are the critical factors for the vegetation, and these are sort of the critical factors for the engineering. And in the middle of that, there'll be a solution. Now, it won't be, it's like all these things, it won't be ideal, it's going to be a compromise. So, look, time-wise, it will be, at the minimum, probably a year to 2 years. Maximum, I think, you know, the original, one of the discussions was talking about 10 to 15 years. That really gradual approach going down. So, can I say it's going to be somewhere in between those?
So if it was 1 to 2 years, I mean, have you got any idea when the beach might emerge?
Haven't done that work yet.
But people are going to want to know when will the beach emerge?
Yeah. No. That's a really good question. What we've got is the bathymetry, so that's the underwater contours for the lake, and that will determine that. So yeah.
That would be really interesting in that context.
I'll put that in to make sure we have that.
Yeah.
That's a simple maths equation. But the water, I'd like to see it getting used.
That's a political question.
Pardon?
Used as in?
I don't know, but seeing it's going down the rivers, we're in a state of...
It's still valuable going down that river, and when you look at the land use or water use changes we've had down the Huon, with all the salmon farms and that sort of thing, even though the area under Pedder for the Huon catchment is only 5% of that catchment, it's still significant to have those natural flows and flushes going through. So, you know, I think that will be a really significant positive in terms of that. Yeah.
But there may be a way that people with imagination can think of using it too.
So the paddling community will probably enjoy it. Imagine.
Well, speaking of the paddling community, just to let you know we're having a paddle for Pedder in February.
Yeah, February 29th to the 1st of March. And so it's going to be a bit of a gathering taking place. We were just inviting people to come down on the Saturday and to raise some funds as well in advance to sort of get your sponsors going. And then on the Sunday, we'll be paddling out 25 kilometres for those that are strong enough and game enough to raise a banner above the original beach. And so we've got some really great videographers like Luca and Andy and Dan and others that will be capturing that for us to share nationally. But on the Saturday night as well, we'll have a really nice communal dinner cooked by a really lovely, talented chef, Lisa Searle, and it'll be a really lovely gathering and experience. So bring your guitars and you're ready to sit by a fire and share some stories. Yeah.
Great time to celebrate the leap year.
It's a great time to celebrate the leap year.
So publicise it amongst your friends. Perfect demographic to think about coming out on the paddle for Pedder for that over that long weekend. It'll be really good. Any other questions?
About the is there sort of much data about the potential benefits to aquatic species that might be able to migrate further up the...
Yeah, look, there is. And that's been the big driver of dam removal in the US because they've got a lot of these diadrama species, these ones that actually need to migrate up lakes and things to it, or migrate up rivers, so that's salmon in particular. And so the US currently is leading the world in dam removal, and there's some big dams coming out there, and that's for fish passage. and that's actually for recreation purposes and things as well. People are realising dewatering rivers is probably not the thing to do. So in Tasmania, yes, we do have a lot of good information because there's only a few rivers that actually haven't been dammed in their entirety. So there's Australian grayling, there's quite a few fish species, and of course there's elver species, there's eels that need passage up the rivers as well. So the removal, those dams, Hydro does have eel ladders and fish ladders on smaller dams, but Edgar and Clark Dam, they just, because they're old dams, they haven't got that configuration as well. So that's one area where we've got a fish biologist who's been doing a lot of work on Tassie rivers, actually having a look at that and trying to quantify I suppose how much more extent of fish habitat and breeding area, because you've got to think about the rivers that were actually dammed under there. They were, although they were on really low nutrient geology, they actually had this, you know when you go down the Gordon River or the Franklin River that you get that tannin coloured water. But they've actually got quite a really unique water characteristics. And so you look at the rivers that have been dammed under the Lake Pedder, and you've got the Serpentine River, so it's got this particular geomorphological flow and this geomorphological pattern. So it's quite unique in that area because it was a big flat basin. You look at a lot of the southwest, and it's really unique to have that flat basin. Well, it is now anyway. So those rivers are quite unique. So aquatic-wise, there are a lot of species that probably weren't investigated properly, that we don't even know what was there. There was also the Pedder galaxid, which of course, once the dam was built and we had trout in there and things, is now extinct in the wild. Well, there's a population in Lake Oberon. Yeah, I'd say the wild. And the Strathgordon water supply. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, no, I've seen those little ones there, and they're breeding successfully now, which is great. So there's two areas, but I mean that's not the wild. It's
could we? Could they be put back in Pedder, or we have to eradicate the trout?
The trout would have to be eradicated.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Look, I was discussing this with someone because what happens when you dam a lake is that you've got all this water access. And for predators like trout, that's actually perfect because they can move through quite easily and that sort of thing. Going back to the smaller rivers, the finer streams and that sort of thing, it gives the little fish a better chance. Yeah, compared to the trout.
And what about the platypus?
Okay. Yeah, platypus. I will answer this.
So will 4,000 platypus die, Anita?
I think there'll be numerous platypus. I won't put a number on it. There'll be multitude of platypus on the move.
Yeah.
And that's one of the considerations with the speed of going down. But the big consideration with that, I won't call it a scientific claim, that claim was that this is Lake Pedder here. And someone sat in a boat here and they counted the number of platypus here. And I think everyone will know that platypus, they need burrows. They don't like really deep water because they've got to come up to breathe and that sort of thing. And then they'll go around and they just snuffle around and they get the macroinvertebrates and that sort of thing. So they're largely a species that needs to be around a shoreline. So we've got Lake Pedder here, filled all that up. This person counted the number of platypus in this area here and then multiplied it by the whole lake. Now the whole lake is not platypus habitat. So one of the important things that we're doing, and we haven't finalised it, but I'll just say that the results are showing that once you drain Lake Pedder and you have this series of sinuous little rivers coming back in here and you have so much more bank area and that sort of stuff, the whole amount of edge that we're going to expose of potential rivers will be so much more than the edge to area ratio of Lake Pedder. So the platypus will be on the move, I would say, but we're just getting some information well, there's plenty known about their habitat and that sort of thing. So yeah, it will probably be quite a positive thing for the platypus.
Great. Any other questions?
The energy loss, as mentioned, the cattle
Hill
plus 6 more turbines. when I said that to someone in the street today, they said, yeah, but what about when the wind don't blow? And I said, look, I'm sure that this is based on the annual output. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Am I correct? So the annual output of Cattle Hill plus, if there was another 6 turbines, although there's a proposal to have an equivalent size, there is a much larger wind farm beside Cattle Hill.
St Patrick's Plains, yeah.
That's St Patrick's Plains, which is, I think it's bigger than Cattle Hill, is it?
Yeah.
So that one alone would replace the need for any generating capacity associated with Lake Pedder.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I can give you the actual figures, Dick, if you want them. So the Gordon Power Station, this is between the 1st of July 2018 and the 26th of June this year, so approximately a year. The Gordon Power Station generated 1,485 gigawatts of energy, so that's 16.1% of total hydro generation came out of Lake Gordon. Pedder, according to the hydro, contributes 42% of water, so therefore Pedder contributed 624 gigawatt hours of energy in that year. That is 5.7% of Tasmania's total demand. So Cattle Hill Wind Farm has 48 turbines, expected to generate 148.5 megawatts, and assuming a capacity factor of 35, so that takes into account the up and down, yes. They are assuming 455 gigawatt hours. So we're looking at 455 from Cattle Hill and Pedder contributing 624. So you're going to need 66 turbines the size of the ones at Cattle Hill to completely replace the energy from Pedder. So that is just on wind, but of course you wouldn't just do it with wind. You could have a couple of solar farms, you could do some energy efficiency projects, and frankly, if Temco falls over, Tasmania's demand, we don't actually know, or Chris, you might, I don't actually know how much demand on the system Temco is, but it's the 3rd largest bulk consumer. So we're expecting an announcement for them to say they're either closing down, going into care and maintenance, or selling. Any of those 3 scenarios.
Be about 5%, be about Pedder.
It's equivalent. Yes, so it's unpublished, and it's Jack Building's been trying to find out the actual figure. It's not published anywhere, unfortunately. It was crazy.
And what price they pay. Like,
that's
another issue, Dick. Let's just go to the demand.
Yeah.
But I believe Temco alone would replace the 5.7% demand.
It gets a bit complicated because I believe that the closure of Temco is sort of being used as a lever to try to get approval for the second Basslink.
Yeah.
In particular because the Tamblin report, which came out subsequent to the breach of Basslink and looking at getting another, their recommendation was there's no business case for it unless two provisions, and the second one was energy demand in Tasmania is significantly reduced. That's code for someone closing down.
Yeah.
So until such time as we're in surplus, which we're not at the moment, then there's no business case for a second Basslink. The closure of Temco would put us close to being in surplus, along with the 2 new oncoming wind farms. They can argue we've got surplus and we don't know how to get rid of it. We need another.
And isn't that the point about the days of the hydro system providing power to these big industrial users is gone? The reason that the raison d'etre now is Basslink gives the Tasmanian government a huge cash inflow every time it's turned on. So they're not going to be terribly interested in getting rid of their storage while they're making whatever it is. I think it's $70,000 or $80,000 per hour every time that cable is working. A second cable, even more.
It's a taboo issue you're talking about, because as soon as you start talking about closure of major industries, it becomes a hot potato. But one of the things you can say, and it follows on from exactly what you were saying, a very good question, is until now, virtually now, the hydro, when it has come to framing long-term contracts with the bulk users, they've done it in tandem with people from Treasury to make sure that the hydro doesn't undermine the state interest. And there's never been a fallback. The hydros had to end up sucking up to whatever the big industries want because they haven't got any other future. Now, especially now that they've got this idea of building 5 BAS links, it means the security of the remaining big users in Tasmania, not just Temco, but all the 3 of those metallurgical industries, they're very insecure. The aluminium smelter itself was sold out by Rio because it's too small. It's a small smelter and it's not in world scale, etc. And Pacific Aluminium took it on because buying it cheap, you can still
Make money.
but it's not a sort of thing which where you're going to invest any more money in, and it's only because it's got existing sunk infrastructure funds put into it that it's a viable plant. It's not a viable plant otherwise, and because of its low price that they've got.
Yeah.
So
but the other thing is, Basslink doesn't make a profit. Contrary to all that's been said, it does not make a profit. The best it's ever done is broken even, and we are importing huge amounts of coal-fired power. So that's why Tasmania is not 100% renewable. We used to be, but we're not now, because we're importing coal from Victoria in order for them to export hydro at the highest prices they can, as you rightly say, into the peak. The only time hydro made any substantial money out of Basslink was when we had the carbon price, but that was for a very short period of time, and that's when they ran down the storages in order to max the return. Then Basslink broke down, then they had to bring in the diesel generators and it cost them a fortune. It was that era of complete, utter mismanagement. But that is why hydro will never provide the figures for Basslink separately. They amalgamate the figures of all of their businesses, 5 or 6 businesses they have, into one line of profit and loss. So you cannot interrogate each of their businesses to see which is making a profit and which isn't. And I was told recently that Paul Lennon's big idea of bringing gas to Tasmania in 2000, there was never a business case for it, but he wanted to be the electric Eric of gas and bring gas infrastructure to Tasmania. I have been told recently that Hydro Tasmania was instructed to pay $1 million a month for the hire of that gas pipeline to subsidise the price of gas to gas consumers in Tasmania, because if gas consumers in Tasmania had to pay the full price, they would never be able to afford it. So that means Hydro Tasmania is absorbing $12 million of a subsidy for gas. This is just outrageous. So all of these issues will come up in the context of, can we afford to take Pedder out of the system? But the answer is, on pure energy terms, yes, we absolutely can. It is not very much energy in the scheme of things. But whether it suits the politics of arguing for all the more interconnectors and things, that is why there is a political strategy, as well as an energy one, as well as an economics and a science and so on.
Won't it all depend on who pays for the interconnectors though too?
Well, that's true.
If that's federal infrastructure, like
that's right.
So Angus Taylor's been saying the other day.
But what's happening there is that's moving. It's a moving feast and it's moving by the day. Yesterday, energy storage. I mean, you wouldn't build it if you weren't going down this battery of the nation idea. You wouldn't put in extra gas links. Energy storage, every single state has decided they're going to be in this business of competing on energy storage. Yesterday, AGL announced that in New South Wales they're going to install twice the battery capacity that South Australia has installed with their...
Monster.
Yes, and the day before, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation was given $1 billion by the federal government for energy storage schemes to secure the grid. Now, who's going to hold that $1 billion? Everyone in Australia is going to be saying, we can do it, we can do it, we can do it. So this rosy idea that we're going to be a battery of the nation, what the federal government is trying to avoid is to throw a whole stack of money at any one project, because then everyone else is going to be jumping up and down. So when you get to the next COAG meeting, there's not only going to be demands on infrastructure funds for securing the grid, but now we've got half the towns in the inland Australia now have no water supply, and they're going to be calling for infrastructure funds just for their basic water supply. So it's just all the balls are up in the air.
Yeah, and I was told by someone who's looking at this that basically every state is now trying to produce the cheapest renewable energy and the cheapest storage, because they're going to think they're going to sell it to one another. And the fact of the matter is, cheap energy and storage is cheapest in the place it's produced. So once you start trying to send it off with your transmission losses are great. So you're going to have this situation where Victoria, South Australia, we're all going to be competing to flog one another cheap energy, but actually it's never going to be cheaper than what we can use here. So it's quite interesting. Any other questions?
Just one last quick question. If there was no interconnector and Temco left, we are subsidising them as consumers, and it's a simple thing that they're paying about, say, 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour. We're paying 27 cents a kilowatt hour. But we built dams that we didn't need to provide electricity for them, and we're paying the interest on all those lines to that the hydro took out. So really, they've stuffed us up as consumers.
So
yes, that's right. Sorry.
Well, what do you do in consequence? I don't know if it's...
Well, if Temco goes...
well, I think there's a huge opportunity. You could electrify the whole transport fleet in Tasmania fast. We are the one place where we've got enough energy to do it. We could just declare we're going to electrify the transport fleet. We could electrify agriculture. How great would that be, having all those irrigators and everything driven by renewable energy instead of diesel, or your dairies driven by electricity instead of diesel generators and the rest of it? You could have, Tasmania could really demonstrate what it means to electrify everything, and it'd be great. Yes.
How much would that cost though to pretty much transfer from running on diesel and petrol to just electricity? Surely that would be a huge cost.
If imagine that we're not connected to anywhere and we've got all this generating capacity in Tasmania, then why wouldn't we use it to basically enable Tasmanians to do things? So that would mean that the government would start using its procurement money to help subsidise electric vehicles. You'd have a whole lot of programs to enable people to get renewable energy on farm. It'd have to be a state and hydro engaged strategy, but it could be done easily because the technology exists to enable us to do it. It's rare that anywhere's got enough renewable energy to actually drive it, so it's actually making it work.
So another way to look at it is the energy transition is going to be facilitated by the market eventually, but the role of government, and this is for instance Norway, has interceded to make sure that that transition happens as fast as it possibly can happen, rather than wait. There are several ways of doing that. I mean, just the easy one in Tasmania is for every government car that's bought to be an electric car, because once you start setting up the infrastructure of sales and servicing and all that sort of stuff, then it flows on into the public and private sector, and so forth. So there's not actually a huge cost so much, but the facilitation is to get a culture into everyone's heads that this is the way we have to go, and if you can get there ahead of anybody else, then good on you.
Just as a tiny example, when I got into the Senate, the Priuses had just come out, the hybrid cars, and as a federal senator you can choose a vehicle on the list of vehicles that the Commonwealth give you for free. That as a senator you just get given a car, you can choose from the list, and of course the Prius wasn't on it. And so Bob and I said, well, we wrote to them and said we actually want a Prius, and they said, oh no, that's not on the list. You can have one of those Hiluxes, you can have, you can have any of them, but you can't have that. Anyway, we argued the toss and we got 2 of them. And so we were driving around in Hobart with virtually the only 2 Priuses here, and then the taxi industry got excited about the prospect because they couldn't wait for any government vehicles to come into the second-hand market, because for taxis the hybrids are absolutely perfect because they're a lot cheaper to run. So the taxi driver started putting pressure on the other federal politicians, saying everybody should be getting this car. And so rapidly, and because our cars turned over every 50,000 Ks or something like that, our cars were quite rapidly getting into the taxi fleet. Yeah. And that's how the hybrids started getting into the taxi fleet in Tasmania, just by virtue of government procurement, and then feeds the second-hand industry. So you can imagine if a government decides, New Zealand has done this, they've said that all government procurement has to now be low emissions and low waste. And the government procurement in New Zealand makes up 15% of their whole GDP. That is a hell of a lot of money in New Zealand that the government will now spend only on low emissions goods and services. So imagine if the Hobart City Council replaced its entire car fleet with electric vehicles, if the state government did, if the hospitals did, if the school, everyone did, there'd be an enormous amount of second-hand electric vehicles. It would speed it up. And if you had a program to say, all right, the whole dairy industry is now going to go electric, the whole irrigation industry is now going to go electric, you would feed all of that very fast. So we could do it. Orkney, which is very much smaller than Tasmania, but one of the islands, the island chains off Scotland, has done this, and they've basically got excess renewable energy, and they've integrated to try and make everything in Orkney electric, and it's just amazing at how inspired people are. So we could actually do that here with the energy capacity we've got. At one stage there was a proposal for a partial restoration, which required quite a lot of engineering works and pipes and that sort of stuff. The committee reached a stage that said, no, we've thought about partial restoration, but if we're going to do this, we should do it properly. So we should restore the lot. Yeah. And that just begs the question then of, do you remove the dams entirely to try and bring integrity back to the landscape? Yes, by all means, if you want to go.
Yes, sorry. Thanks for having me so much. It's been really good.
No, it's been lovely to see you here. Can we get your contact details so we have? Okay, great.
Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. There's some discussion as to whether to satisfy, this comes to socio-cultural issues, to satisfy the pride, if you like, that people have taken in building these hydro dams, whether you should perhaps leave one of them there high and dry, but as a gesture of respect to the people who built them.
There's also practical issues around that.
But anyway, so it's been put to me that you could actually leave the Serpentine Dam because it will be just high and dry, but you couldn't leave Scott's Peak because you would still have to do maintenance on it. Otherwise it wouldn't be safe. And so if you have to spend money on maintenance, you might as well spend the money to remove it. So that's why one of the reports we're going to get done is on engineering, to have a look at what in reality, can you just open the gates and leave the rest of it? The other thing is, one of the people who was involved in building them said that the quarries for those dams are right beside those dams. So you can actually refill the quarry, which means you would have a new fake hill next to them, which you could easily revegetate and just have as a fake hill. But those questions as to whether you have to maintain the structure even if you dam it and what you unplug it, important engineering safety questions. And then I'm not really in favour of the idea of leaving a monument to hydro-industrialisation in the middle of the wilderness, but that's a discussion.
There's still plenty of monuments.
We have got plenty of other monuments, we don't have to go there. But yes, ideally it is a total restoration and a removal of the structures.
Yeah, and the other question goes to energy production, renewable energy production to replace what's lost. On that degraded land, you do have the Gordon Power Station and the transmission lines. Is there scope, or is it they're thinking to create wind or solar on degraded land that's not where Pedder was, that feeds into that, or is that not?
Well, the issue is the World Heritage Area. The operational guidelines of the World Heritage Area state quite specifically that you cannot degrade a World Heritage Area more than it was degraded at the time that it was declared to be World Heritage. And at the point at which any of those activities, degrading activities, cease, in this case Pedder, then you're obliged to rehabilitate the area to as close to its natural state as you can. So because it's a World Heritage Area, you wouldn't be wanting to degrade it any further, and that would be seen as a degradation of the World Heritage Area. The second thing to think about is that the hydro wants to shift to a peaking, to respond to peaking power in Victoria. That would mean another turbine on the Gordon scheme, but there are very strict rules about how much water can go down the Gordon River at any one time because of the erosion issues. So I don't know how they think they're going to go to a peaking on and off system when they've got to adhere to strict erosion rules down the river. So that is something we have to think about into the future. And then the other thing that the hydro knows about that we don't is that in 2007 the hydro had to downgrade its input to the catchments because of global warming, and they downgraded it by 10%, is that right, Chris, in 2007, by 10% as expected to be reduced inflow, and that was because of the drying out of the soils as well as reduced rainfall, etc. So that's 2007. They have not publicly released any figures since, and we are now, nearly 13 years subsequent to that, and global warming has accelerated in that time. So you'd have to assume that their figures would have to be downgraded again by at least most conservatively 5%. So they know that run-of-the-river hydro schemes are actually going to face a crisis with water input. And that's why I think they want to go to just pumped hydro, where it just goes round and round, and they don't have to rely on that catchment input. So increasingly, Pedder is going to be, there's going to be less and less water in the southwest for the hydro schemes, and Tasmanians have been denied any discussion about this because the hydro won't put the figures out there, so none of us actually know what their projections actually are.
Yeah. I walked across to Gordon Dam a couple of weeks ago, and I wonder about the life span of that actual dam. Like, how long does that thing actually last?
Well, all concrete under stress actually has a limited lifespan. I've never seen any figures, but if you, by comparison, the breach which spans the Derwent, the legs of that go right down into it, and that's got a terminal life. They've expended quite a few $1 million in the last decade in doing some restoration on the footings to lengthen to increase the longevity of that particular bridge. But all concrete structures that are under stress, and it's usually the reinforcing rather than the mix that is affected by it, but that dam has got a limited life, you could say.
Yeah. It's a pretty precarious thing, so it's like...
It's probably decades, but still, you have to look at it.
Okay. Well, I think we'll wind it up there because people are having to go, but thank you for coming along. It's great to have this discussion about all the issues. Thank you very much.